I was 35 when my life changed forever at that fateful family dinner. My stepmother, Patricia, placed her manicured hand firmly on my father's will, her cold eyes piercing through me like daggers. "You will not get a single cent of your father's money, Ryan. That is final." I had sacrificed my thriving tech career to care for my dying father for 2 years while she barely visited his bedside. Yet there I was, being denied my inheritance. "All right," I smiled calmly. "Then do not expect a single cent from me either." I slowly set my fork and knife down and stood up. Weeks later, nightmare struck their perfect little family. Before I continue with this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe to support the channel. Every subscription helps me share more real-life stories like this one that might change your perspective on family and forgiveness. My childhood was actually quite happy before everything fell apart. I grew up in a modest suburban home in Portland with my parents, who seemed to love each other deeply. My father, James, was a civil engineer who specialized in bridge construction. He was my hero, a gentle giant with calloused hands who would spend weekends teaching me how to build everything from tree houses to model airplanes. He believed in me unconditionally, always telling me that with enough persistence, I could accomplish anything. My mother and father divorced when I was 12. While the separation was relatively amicable, it changed everything. My mother moved to Seattle for work, and I stayed with her during the school year, visiting Dad on holidays and summers. It was during one of those summer visits, about a year after the divorce, that Dad introduced me to Patricia. Patricia came from old money, her family having made their fortune in real estate development. She was elegant, poised, and always perfectly put together, but there was something calculating in her gaze when she looked at me. From the very beginning, there was a coldness between us, an invisible wall she never attempted to break down. Dad was too in love to notice, or perhaps he chose not to. They married 6 months later, and suddenly I had 2 step-siblings, Thomas and Jessica, who were 15 and 14 at the time. Every visit afterward became increasingly uncomfortable. Patricia would make subtle remarks about how much I resembled my mother, a woman she had never even met. She would schedule family activities when she knew I would be visiting my father, then act surprised that the timing conflicted, but I endured it all for Dad. "Then do not expect a single cent from me either." I slowly set my fork and knife down and stood up. Weeks later, nightmare struck their perfect little family. Before I continue with this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe to support the channel. Every subscription helps me share more real-life stories like this one that might change your perspective on family and forgiveness. My childhood was actually quite happy before everything fell apart. I grew up in a modest suburban home in Portland with my parents, who seemed to love each other deeply. My father, James, was a civil engineer who specialized in bridge construction. He was my hero, a gentle giant with calloused hands who would spend weekends teaching me how to build everything from tree houses to model airplanes. By the time I hit 33, I was leading a team developing healthcare applications, making more money than I had ever dreamed possible, and had just been shortlisted for a promotion to Chief Technology Officer. My personal life was equally fulfilling. I had been dating Ashley for nearly 3 years. She was a pediatric nurse with a wicked sense of humor who understood my demanding schedule because hers was just as hectic. He has been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors are giving him 6 months, maybe a year, with aggressive treatment. The world stopped spinning for a moment. Dad was only 61. He had retired just 2 years earlier, planning to travel and enjoy the life he had worked so hard to build. He had seemed perfectly healthy when I visited at Christmas, just 3 months prior. "I need to see him," I said immediately. "Yes, you should come," Patricia replied, her voice uncharacteristically subdued. "He is asking for you." I took the first flight out the next morning. When I arrived at the hospital, I barely recognized the man in the bed. Dad had always been robust, tall and strong. Now he looked hollowed out, his skin yellowed and hanging loosely on his frame. But his eyes, those kind brown eyes that had always seen the best in me, lit up when I entered the room. "There is my boy," he whispered hoarsely, reaching out a hand that seemed to have aged decades in just months. I made a decision that day, sitting beside his hospital bed while he slept. My company had offered to let me work remotely for a few weeks, but as I watched my father's chest rise and fall, I knew weeks would not be enough. This man had given me everything, had shaped me into the person I was. I could not abandon him now, when he needed me most. The next day, I called my boss and explained the situation. He was sympathetic but clear about the consequences. The CTO position would go to someone else. They could keep me on remotely in my current role, but my career trajectory would effectively stall. I accepted the terms without hesitation. Ashley was supportive when I told her, though I could hear the concern in her voice. "We will make it work," she promised. "I will fly out whenever I can." I rented a small apartment near my father's home and settled in for what I knew would be a difficult journey. What I did not anticipate was just how isolated that journey would be. While Patricia did not openly object to my presence, she made it clear I was an intruder in her home. Thomas and Jessica visited rarely, always with excuses about their busy lives in New York and Boston, respectively. "Yes, you should come," Patricia replied, her voice uncharacteristically subdued. "He is asking for you." I took the first flight out the next morning. When I arrived at the hospital, I barely recognized the man in the bed. Dad had always been robust, tall, and strong. Now he looked hollowed out, his skin yellowed and hanging loosely on his frame. But his eyes, those kind brown eyes that had always seen the best in me, lit up when I entered the room. 6 months in, she tearfully told me she had met someone else. I could not even find it in myself to be angry. I had chosen this path, and I would not regret it, no matter the cost. Those 2 years were both the most painful and most precious of my life. As Dad's body failed him, our bond grew stronger. We talked about everything during those long nights when pain kept him awake. He shared stories of his own father, regrets about his marriage to my mother, his hopes for my future. Never once did he complain about his fate. In his final weeks, when hospice care took over, Patricia finally began spending more time at home. But she was more concerned with making arrangements, speaking with lawyers, and managing appearances than sitting with my father. Thomas and Jessica flew in looking uncomfortable in the face of their stepfather's mortality, making brief appearances at his bedside before retreating to discuss inheritance matters in hushed tones with their mother. Dad died on a quiet Sunday morning in October. I was holding his hand, telling him about a new cancer treatment breakthrough I had read about, still desperately clinging to hope, when he took his last breath. Patricia, Thomas, and Jessica were having brunch on the patio, having decided Dad was stable enough for them to take a break. I was alone with him at the end, just as I had been alone with him through most of his illness. The funeral was a lavish affair, more a social event than a memorial. Patricia greeted guests in an expensive black dress, accepting condolences with practiced grace, while I stood awkwardly to the side. Thomas and Jessica performed grief well for the cameras, but I had seen how quickly they checked their watches during their hospital visits. 2 weeks after we laid Dad to rest, Patricia invited me to dinner at the family home. The estate lawyer would be joining us, she explained, to discuss the will. Despite everything, a small part of me felt relieved. Dad had always promised that I would be taken care of. Perhaps this final act of his would bring some closure, some acknowledgement of the sacrifices I had made. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in the same suit I had worn to the funeral. The house was immaculate, as always, family photos arranged perfectly on the mantel. I noticed that several pictures of Dad and me had been removed, replaced with more recent ones of Patricia with Thomas and Jessica. They arrived together, the 3 of them dressed as if for a business meeting. The family lawyer, Mr. Harrington, followed shortly after carrying a leather portfolio and greeting Patricia with the familiarity of an old friend. We sat around the dining table, an elaborate meal laid out by Patricia's housekeeper. Mr. Harrington cleared his throat and began to read the will. Most of it was standard legal language, but I listened intently for any mention of my name. It never came. Instead, the will stated clearly that all assets were to be left to Patricia with the understanding that she would distribute portions to the children as she saw fit. I was confused at first. Surely there was some provision, some specific bequest meant for me. Dad would never have left my future entirely in Patricia's hands. He knew better than anyone the tension between us. Mr. Harrington finished reading and closed the portfolio. Patricia waited until the lawyer excused himself to use the bathroom before she made her move. She pulled out a separate document from a folder beside her plate, placing it deliberately on the table. "This is the actual inheritance distribution," she announced, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Thomas and Jessica will each receive 30% of the estate. The remaining 40% stays with me." I stared at her, waiting for her to continue to mention my share. She placed her hand firmly on the document and looked me straight in the eye. "You will not get a single cent, Ryan. You are not truly part of this family anymore. You have not been since your mother took you away. But I spent the last 2 years caring for him." I protested, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "I gave up everything." "That was your choice," Patricia replied coldly. "James was my husband, and this is my family now. Thomas and Jessica are his legal heirs. They are your children, not his," I said, anger finally breaking through my shock. "They barely visited him. They hardly knew him." Thomas leaned forward, his expression smug. "It does not matter what you think, Ryan. The will gives Mom full discretion, and she has made her decision." Jessica at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, staring down at her untouched plate of food. I looked from face to face, reality dawning on me with sickening clarity. This had been the plan all along. Patricia had been the one to draft the will, taking advantage of Dad's illness and medication. She had systematically isolated me, tolerated my presence, only because it freed her from caregiver duties, all while preparing to cut me out completely. "All right," I said, finally surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "Then do not expect a single cent from me either." I slowly set my fork and knife down and stood up. "What is that supposed to mean?" Patricia scoffed. "It means that when you are old and need someone to drive you to doctor appointments, or when your children are too busy with their important lives to visit, you do not call me. You have made your choice about what family means to you." I have learned my lesson. I walked out without looking back, ignoring Patricia's indignant protests and Thomas's mocking laughter. In my car, I finally allowed myself to break down sobs, racking my body as I mourned not just my father, but the final death of any illusion of family I might have harbored. That night, I packed my belongings and checked out of my rental apartment. I had already given notice at my job, planning to look for something new, closer to what I had thought would be my inheritance. Now, I had nothing holding me there, no reason to stay in a city filled with painful memories. I drove east without a clear destination, eventually settling in Chicago, where a former colleague offered me a position at a healthcare startup. It was several steps down from my previous role, but I was grateful for the opportunity to start fresh. I rented a small studio apartment downtown and threw myself into work, trying to rebuild the career I had sacrificed. Ashley reached out once, having heard about Dad's passing through mutual friends.